Okay, circles.
So we look at the first question about issues about evaluation and what sorts of methods you might use and so forth. And we talked about the challenges that were involved in a combination of methods: interviews, questionnaires, observations, tracking and logging users by giving them devices as they walked around and watching where they held the devices up against, collecting data about where they held the device up against tags on objects. We talked about then also collecting audio and video information as they walk through. And one of the challenges we had with all this data is the methods of analysis for this. And we think that one of the recommendations we go on to make later is that you actually need a wider range of much more sophisticated evaluation techniques than we currently use, and much more computationally based methods, instead of doing it all by hand coding and small discrete analysis. So we also want to push the sophistication of the analytics that's done, in particular when you're collecting quantitative data sets, statements from people, interviews, so that you can automate their coding and use text mining to pull key themes out and make cross comparisons and so forth. Another problem that we had, which we come on to in the second stage, is the question about cross-institutional comparative approaches. That, hey, you're all looking at who's coming to visit, you're all looking at who's using your websites and the kind of searches they're doing, but you're not collecting data in a comparative way and sharing it so that you can look cross-institutionally at the outcomes, except maybe in some discrete projects. And one of the issues that we were also very interested in is the problem about the retrospective construction of memories of visits. So visitors come, they go around and they do the tour, and then you talk to them you interview them, and they actually reconstruct the memory of what their visit was like, as opposed to telling you exactly. And how do you differentiate and how do you work through those processes to get pure, clean data and senses and description of experience? But really what we were, some of the bigger questions that we looked at in terms of evaluation was, there's the conflict between qualitative and quantitative data. And we don't actually believe that that's a conflict. We actually believe we have to find a way to make them work more effectively together and to smooth the curves between them and look at the interdependence of those particular methods. We were concerned about the representativeness of the data samples that we're collecting, both in terms of visitors, but also in terms of non-visitors. We don't often collect that. Analytic methods, and the fact that in terms of selection and use of methods, many of our colleagues really only use a very narrow set of methodological techniques, and we need to expand the set of methodological techniques we use, which really means that we need to better educate the folks who are doing evaluations in museums to give them the skills to do that. But fundamentally, the real question that we had in this section about evaluation was that we really need to press institutions think about what the strategic mandate of the institution is, what the strategic mandate of that special exhibition is, when they're planning and designing the evaluation, so that they actually do the evaluation against the mandate as opposed to against some generic ideas about collecting data in terms of an evaluation, that it'd be nice to know these things. Well, how does it actually relate to your strategic mandate? So, one of the things that you really want to be doing then is creating information that allows you to measure impact. And impact isn't always through footfall. And you want to be able to be collecting information that allows you to be able to collect headline stories. Things that convince funders, convince policymakers that what's happening in your institution and the kinds of experiences folks are having really are making a difference. So then we turn very briefly to the policy side of this. You can see that we use most of our time in the first section. So going back to what I said about increasing the number of analytic methods, we agree that we need more focus on the agility of method application. We need to be much more agile in how we do that. We don't use most of the data that is collected in the heritage sector, and there were some examples given around the table that about data going back 50, 60 years that's not used for longitudinal studies. But we also don't share data between institutions, and maybe we need an evaluation repository somewhere where we can collect and share data on a cross-institutional basis. We did talk about the question about the value of standardization, and time runs against me, so I'm not going to try and explain in exact detail what we talked about was, but we see some value in standardization, but we actually believe there might be computational mechanisms for you to compensate for working with non-standard data sets. And we should be evaluating and considering how those might work and how we might actually apply them. But it all depends on us building a comprehensive set of data that we share across institutions that we can do that. And the last point was, how can we use the types of analytic and recommender technologies that are used in the commercial sector within the cultural sector to improve both our processing of data, but also extracting the value from it in terms of helping our visitors to improve their experience. Now, the very interesting thing about all this evaluation that I only think of as I come to the end of this is that this is all about evaluation that we do after the visit to inform future visitor experiences, or to justify why we've done certain things to funders, or to say, hey, we did a great job. None of this is actually about instantaneous evaluation to improve the visitor experience while the visitor's there. And a lot of the techniques and the methods that we actually are using, we ought to be able to feed into automatic feedback, observing that some visitors look absolutely bored when they're visiting, having collected enough information about them to all of a sudden change a label through digital interactive labels to brighten up the visitor's day by collecting 2 or 3 pieces that they've already seen and telling them a new story that they didn't expect to get at the next waypoint that they come along to in the museum. So there's evaluation for long-term value, but also there's the possibility of thinking about evaluation for near-term experience improvement. Okay? Does anyone have anything to add? Okay? Great.
I have worked with museums and colleagues here who work in libraries. So what we found out was, and I think that's quite obvious, that our colleagues from the libraries tend to have metrics and statistics and do evaluations working with audiences that are mainly online but not on-site. So one of the differences we identified is that talking about evaluation of the digital cultural heritage resources in museums, we're talking mainly about evaluating the experiences as well on-site and online. Okay. So what we found out while we were discussing this is that given the nature of these online audiences, it's quite natural to go to using metrics or statistics about, for example, how many people visited from this country, how many this month, etc., etc. One of the issues that we also identified was sometimes knowing just the what but not the why can be a little bit frustrating. For example, we found out that in one case, so the target group or audience is supposed to be people in Scotland, right? You have great audiences from China or the United States, but it's not possible really to know why. Another thing we discussed about was what to evaluate, and we found out, or we agreed, I think, that there's no single recipe there, and that it depends on what it is you want to evaluate, what's your target audience, what's the experience as well you are targeting. We discussed quite a lot as well about the way different, well, let's say the hierarchy or the organization, the infrastructure in a cultural heritage institution might actually have an impact on the ways evaluation is carried out, how much of it is carried out, and what kind of data can be gathered, how that can be analyzed. We also talked quite a lot about the gaps, current gaps. So there are quite a lot of things that we could see there. For example, it's a question of, or it can be a question of resources, time that may be available or not. Also, whether or not is kind of quite obvious that there is a need for doing this, carrying out evaluation and, well, then analyzing these findings and lessons learned. We also, I think, agreed on the fact that sometimes there's not a lot of maybe discussion about the different advantages and disadvantages that qualitative and quantitative methodologies may have. So that means that toolkits or frameworks that could better explain the value of evaluation and the different tools to proceed might be really valuable. And I think that's an issue you also raised about exchanging as well knowledge together with data, of course, among different institutions. Now, another question I think we discussed had to do with the different stakeholders of a project. So you're doing and carrying out evaluation, but what kind of data or findings is it that you share with your stakeholders? And these stakeholders, for example, are your fellow educators, or it could be the funders of your institution. Well, the data you would need to share or exchange would be quite different, or maybe the data would be the same, but the way you would communicate it would be quite different. Is there, I mean, I'm sure, but
so I guess we're at this table quite coming at the question from quite a sort of not having direct experience of carrying out evaluation, but wanting to learn more about different methods and processes. And so we're discussing a little bit about sort of tangential knowledge that we have from maybe previous projects, or just a slight kind of frustration about knowing what and how you can get that slightly more qualitative feedback without and the time resource that takes, and how it can be quite difficult then. And the creative aspect that you were just talking about was thinking about ways, for myself, thinking about ways for users to contribute that kind of feedback or evaluation of what you're creating for them in a way that allows you to better understand what I explained this much better when we were talking in the group. I'll give the example as I was talking of doing artistic workshops, and rather than using a feedback form, making the evaluation of what they were doing part of the process of creating the art. So there would be an area where during the artistic process they might feel something that they'd learned or were experiencing differently. They would contribute to a kind of collective artwork, as it were, whether it was through words or artistic pieces. And that was a kind of evaluation that allowed the workshop developer to understand how the people were artistically interacting with what they were teaching. But at the same time, that's not very useful data for funder, for example, because it doesn't demonstrate the same types of things that a funder might be interested to know about, but it's good from a development point of view. So, yeah, thinking of creative solutions and thinking of who it is you want the feedback for, who it is you want the evaluation for, I guess. Anyway, I'll hand this back.
Final word maybe that just came. We're discussing about the fact, that evaluation is not just, or should maybe not just be after a project has been launched or ended, but something that can be taken care of as well throughout the full life cycle of a project, by trying out to assess the needs, the risks, the resources to be committed, the advantages, and finding out about the experience. I mean, we're talking about evaluation, so the experience of the end user, but the user can be as well a cultural heritage professional dealing with digital cultural heritage resources as a mean or a way for education, for example. So yes, that's just another aspect of considering evaluation as something that can be, let's say, performed or taken care of, not just as we said, for the front-end formative and summative evaluation, but throughout a longer, let's say, period from the beginning to the end. And that's us.
So my fellow triangles will jump in if I go off script. We had a very positive discussion which led to a lot of complaints about why the world isn't better than it is. Just picking up on the point about projects, and one of the themes in our discussion was that evaluation often is too project-based, too much about a single project rather than evaluating a resource and how it might inform a number of different projects, a number of different activities of an institution. And a particular problem we identified with that is that evaluation then tends to be very short-term. It happens at the end of a project, we record it as the 50 pages thrown in a drawer, and then there's a lack of understanding of long-term use of a project, long-term value of a project. And it also makes kind of future-proofing a project more challenging, because you evaluate the project after 2 years, after 3 years, when you're still developing it, when it's still funding, but not after 6 years, after 10 years, to see if there's a longer-term value of the project or the resource. A related point was also that technology moves very, very quickly. So something that looked very cutting edge 3 years ago, 5 years later can look very dated, and even just the look and feel can put people off. And you're understanding and keeping your evaluation techniques up to date so we can evaluate the true impact of a resource over longer periods of time when the funding is finished is something there is a real lack of. And that, I think relates to policy, that funders will fund a live project. They won't fund you 3 or 4 or 10 years later to actually evaluate what happened after the project finished and they stop funding it. So we don't have these kind of longer term lessons being learnt. And that makes a lot of our evaluation very short term, often very superficial. What we did think about is, some of the data we're collecting, and there's certain core-ish things that we can collect from any resource. We can collect, how many people used the resource, how many people came back to the resource, how many page hits, how long people used it for. Beyond these kind of very generic things, it was much more difficult to interpret the true value of a resource, because every resource is different, and what people want and who uses it might be very different. And so what we have is a lot of very superficial techniques to collect a lot of data that might look convincing, but then going beyond that to actually capture some of the value, some of the unique insights, some of the surprises that you might get from the evaluation is much more difficult. And that's where you actually really need people to come in and to use a combination of techniques to think not just about some of the surprising techniques that you talked about before that are talking about significant value to individuals, but also some of the reasons that you might not have predicted that stop people using your resource, which might be the description of the resource or the name of the resource that you thought you got right, but it's not until you ask somebody why you didn't look past the first page that you realize why they're not using it. One of the things we also talked about was people's expectations. So people are very digitally connected. Most of the people that use our resources use a lot of other resources. So they have expectations from other systems, Google and Amazon, about how systems are going to work generically. And if our systems work differently, do we expect people to learn, overcome a barrier, or do we change how we're building our resources to make them look more like these systems they're already used to? There are values in what we do in terms of archives and how they're constructed. How do we get those lessons across to people if they're not using them professionally, if they don't have to use our resources? How do we encourage them to use different ways of interacting with resources rather than just using similar models already used to? Of course, we were very honest admitting that what we want to do as designers and information architects may not always be what our users want. And what we are, the kind of sexy new novel thing that we're funded to do might not be actually what the users want, who just want a simple search box, a very simple, easy to use system, which will not get you any funding, but it's not, you may be adding things that people don't want. So what is the balance between giving users what they want and getting the funding to do things that are useful and new that will give them access to the resources we want to make available? Like Aretti's group, we also see evaluation as being part of the life cycle of a project. It's not something you do at the end. And it's amazing how many digitization projects don't have any evaluation attached to them. Lorna, though she's disappeared, talked about an HRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council evaluation of how many digitization projects didn't have any evaluation attached to them. And it's a lot. So even though we see evaluation as being very important, lots of people don't. And there's no evaluation. But we see evaluation as being part of the whole life cycle, part of the short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals of any project. Where else did I miss? We did acknowledge that there's a balance between the kind of grab a lot of data quantitative approach, which is very popular and very useful, versus a more time-consuming approaches, surveys, focus groups, evaluations, eye tracking, and so on, that does require a lot of time and effort, but can be very rewarding and very insightful about what people are doing, and has a lot of challenges. And I think we acknowledge the low uptake rate of things like surveys and focus groups, which often tell us more about the people that take part in surveys than what our actual users are doing. And sometimes I think we probably end up evaluating people rather than evaluating resources because of this kind of self-nomination. New technologies for evaluation often raise interesting challenges for participant recruitment. So Jan talked about the challenges of having to ask people to take off their makeup before doing eye tracking. And one participant who almost suffocated. This is not something you have to think about in a survey, but with new techniques you have to think of new barriers and new ways to get people engaged. But what we did agree was that there's a huge potential here for doing really robust science around evaluation, not just doing more evaluations of more projects, but actually seriously thinking about the science, the vocabulary, the discipline of doing evaluation within archives, but museums, libraries, the whole spectrum of access to digital and physical access to cultural heritage. So we think there's a huge potential to do something really significant in this area. Anything anybody wants to throw in? No? Thank you.
Okay. We kind of broke this down, quite a lot of experience around the table of evaluation. We broke it down into different types that we're doing, and there's a lot of crossover with what already has been spoken about this afternoon. So a lot of evaluation done with interfaces, so user experience testing. Good to see a lot of front-end evaluation happening around the table. Experience of evaluation in terms of content development and content testing. A lot of people charged with putting resources into the hands of visitors. So That's why we've talked about that. Experience of online engagement, so that's via bespoke platforms or proprietary kind of social media platforms. Experience of impact evaluation and visitor experiences in larger venues as well. In terms of the methods used to capture that, well, front end seemed to be something that people were kind of keen and well practiced in being able to have as part of kind of formative parts of projects. Lots of different experience of all sorts of different surveys, the types of things we've been talking about today, paper ones, online. A lot of experience of observational around the table. Some summative evaluation experience with the group that we had, and we talked a little bit about different methods that we're using in terms of data analysis online and how we can kind of meaningfully digest that information and bring that back to the wider teams that we're working with. I think we'd split this up quite simply into just advantages and issues, areas where more work was required. In terms of advantages, I think we all spoke about the value of evaluation. I think from the experience of at least a couple of us around the table, being part of quite a small team, being sometimes the only person who's charged with digital evaluation of digital resources, or the only person who's there to produce any form of digital visitor experience, then the value that evaluation has is something that can be seen when it's brought back out to the wider teams where there's no knowledge of digital, so not so much about the evaluation, but about giving value to that resource that perhaps was confusing or a completely new area for non-digitally minded colleagues, and in some organisations they make up the greater number. That kind of crosses over with helping to raise digital literacy as well, to help bring meaning to that resource that has required a lot of resource to develop, a lot of time to develop, a lot of staff, a lot of budget to develop, so bringing that value back. And I suppose the knock-on effects of that are increase in confidence with digital. I mean, that's certainly true for myself as well. It's proof. I think that's how we kind of boiled it and simplified it down to. In terms of the issues, well, I've talked about them in advantages. A lot of conducting and gathering support for need for evaluation. Often it falls short because of lack of resource for the conducting of any particular piece of evaluation. We talked about issues at the ends of projects where there's a kind of widening gap between initial aspiration and outcomes, and how to implement findings back into a project. When I think there's other groups talked about that as well. When a project has finished, being able to meaningfully feed back in the results of a particular resource, large or small. And yeah, that's it. So it's implementing results, and we had a couple of examples around the table where, in terms of evaluation, contingency was built into the development cycle of a piece of software, for example, to be able to implement the results of evaluation. But that was certainly an example that was in the minority, that with evaluation, most projects is coming, the serious evaluation that most people are paying attention to is coming in at the end, when there's no chance for that to be fed back in to the resource. Okay.
Okay, well, our group, apart from Paul, we were lucky enough to have Paul at our table. Our group had very little direct experience creating digital resources in the way that we were talking about today. So we were thinking of it more from the end user's perspective. And we did, it actually sounds quite negative, a lot of the stuff that we've got up, because we were thinking more about the challenges. But there was lots of individual experience about some of the things. And a lot of the issues that we've discussed, you've already kind of covered. So, you know, again, we were mainly as users, but it does depend on the definition of digital cultural resources. I mean, what do we mean by that term, and where does that sort of definition start and stop? Because a sort of digital cultural resource could be accessed in a library database, or it could be some really, really interactive website. It could be, I mean, I suppose it's down to how you actually define what that criteria is. We did have quite a long discussion about the issues of funding and funding for sustainability. And again, this is something that we've kind of talked about quite a lot over the course of the day. I don't know about you, but very often when you're applying for funding, you're applying for the project that you're delivering, and there isn't any funding beyond the life of the actual project itself. Also, funders don't like projects that have already started, so how do you then get funding beyond that to do more evaluation or to build on that original resource? There are lots of tricks of terminology that you can use to do that, like use the first one as formative evaluation, but I think that there is an issue there, and I suppose in terms of the funding bodies, I think that they should recognise that actually, you know, reusing research and turning it into something else or developing it isn't actually a bad thing. We can't always just have new innovation every time, because how often can you reinvent the wheel? There was something that you were talking about, Brianna, in relation to your area. I'll come back to it. Can you remember? It's to do with funding and sustainability. I can't. I'll come back to me. We were looking at how to assess impact and the long-term resourcing of it, or the development of that, and again I suppose that's linked into the actual funding itself. Funding would also link into the policymakers as well, because obviously that's influencing how the funding's been distributed. How to retain or attain authenticity in the resources that you're developing as well. We had quite a long discussion about that. Consideration of the end user and the appeal of the general usage of what it is that's being created or what's being used as a cultural resource. Again, we were focusing on that because that's obviously where our experience lay. I think that if you're creating resources, you have to think about what's the point of it. There's no point in creating an amazing resource that nobody sees. I mean, there was a slide earlier on about reports, 50-page reports that just end up in drawers. Well, you think about the amount of information that's on the World Web. You can create the most amazing thing, but if nobody can find it, if nobody actually sees it, what is the point? It doesn't matter how great it is. So how do you get it to the right people? How do you get it out there? Which I suppose is a kind of marketing thing. Or if it's to do with how you're using search engines, then obviously it's the language that's used in that as well to try and get people to retrieve data. That works on, obviously, resources as well. So again, we had this idea about language and the vocabulary mismatch. And we also said not everything is digital. I can't remember how we got onto that, but we decided to kind of think quite positively about the advantages, because obviously there's loads of them, which is why we do it. Accessibility, and again, the physical and intellectual accessibility of things as well. We kind of often forget about the fact that there are people out there who are not all exactly the same as us. There's different cultural kind of users. There's different people with different accessibility in terms of their physical abilities. So are we considering that when we're actually creating resources? Are we thinking about how practical it is for people that actually maybe can't see as well as we can, or can't understand the language the way we can, or actually the sort of the cultural significance of what we're putting up there is completely different. So how are we balancing that? But I think that the web can do that. That, you know, what's available online can completely open up what we have on offer. Doing something that's reproducible, it provides immediate evidence, but that also obviously doesn't necessarily imply that it provides impact. So again, thinking about how we actually measure that. We didn't really go into specifics about that. I think that's still quite a hard one. Sharing experiences, good ways of sharing best practice. That's again something that obviously has been discussed ad nauseum at the other tables. This idea about, you know, when there's research being done or something's been developed, how do you actually learn from what other people have done? You know, are we all keeping it like this? So it's about how we actually open access in a way that actually everyone can benefit. Okay, then we moved on to question 2. We were trying to kind of be quite specific about what we logged down to make it easier for Marie after this. But I think that when we were talking, there was a lot of overlap between the questions. Obviously, a funding gap, that's a big issue. The ref drives policy, and that can be dangerous. That can be really prescriptive and restrictive and reduce kind of creativity and innovation and development. So again, that's something that I think we have to be aware of. Another thing that we talked about was the idea about a business application of something versus the kind of cultural application of something. They don't always marry up in the same way, but they can still benefit one another if they're cleverly thought through. So data reuse, we talked about that. The danger of everything having to be new. This idea about reinventing the wheel. Why not kind of think about what's been developed and how it can be repurposed or built upon? Infrastructure for sharing. Is this all a marketing problem? Where is the Evaluating Cultural Digital Heritage book for dummies? Which I think there's a great market out there if anybody's interested in developing that little resource. And we finished on actually a question more than any solution, which is what is the value of digital cultural heritage and how do we measure it? So next workshop.
There are several, I think, themes and issues and questions that we can group together. One of the ones we already talked about is the quantity versus quality, and much more I think was very nicely illustrated by the range and breadth of speakers and their experience, but also the context within which they were doing evaluation, and then was also taken over by all the groups. It's really important why you do it, what you're evaluating, and then that should define also your criteria and what you want to get out of it. But that allows for enormous variety. And although it's very important to try to be a bit more systematic and up to date with the latest methodologies that the group over there said, and also combine, definitely, I think was very clear, there's no single golden methodology. It's very important to combine different resources. It's also very important to allow for the richness of the experience and the difficulty of capturing things like learning, engagement with the arts, with much more large-scale data analysis of how people retrieve things when we're talking about very large databases, and that allows for an awful lot of space in between. It's also very important, we talked about, and you all raised the differences in resources and the different kind of cultural heritage institutions. It was also interesting for some of you who haven't done it at all, but would like to use the end results compared to others who are doing it in great depth, and with some of the frustrations of the methods, that getting together in places like this and also not having the walls and the boundaries between the cultural institutions themselves, whether it's a library or a museum, we didn't have that much from archives, for example, today, but also between academia and cultural heritage. It's an important step of maybe overcoming some of those difficulties of the sharing and holding hands rather than reinventing the wheel, reusing data, and I'm not so sure the book for dummies is the answer. But definitely it's worth thinking a little bit about, should maybe the outcome of some of this, maybe the network could be guidelines maybe that take into account the different needs of the sector. Also, there is existing research, but it seems to need a little bit of distilling and combining, synthesizing, maybe translating it into something that's more useful and applicable. Maybe also about different tools and a toolkit, but also with all of these things, what was interesting for me is everybody was saying they need to be very aware of the context, reflexive and thoughtful about how you do it. It was definitely, I think the answer is none of these things are a golden solution of this is the perfect way to do it. And it also requires quite a lot of understanding, both the depth and the breadth. I think we come back to that. So it's also getting the institutional backing. Before you even develop your brilliant cultural digital resource, you also need to kind of work with the others in the team higher up, but also widely with colleagues, with and stakeholders anyway, and different users about what are you trying to get out of it, because it's some of those wider questions that affect how you'll do the evaluation. I think almost all the groups, together with the speakers, confirmed the need to make it a life cycle and and way of working practice within both cultural heritage but also researchers, because I think that's the other interesting thing with evaluation, and the digital in general, the boundaries are blurring between that. It's not that common, you just give it to the researcher outside, you are the digital institution kind of developing the resource. It's much more often about teamwork, and I think it's teamwork in evaluation work as well for it to work effectively, for combining all these different methods. And also it was very interesting to see that the next one being moving from impact to value, it was highlighted in different ways by your discussions. We haven't finalized the speakers for that, so any great ideas about who would be really thought-provoking and useful, we're really open to it. Keep the communicating. The next one is almost certainly 16th of June, so if you can try to put it already in your calendar, we'll follow up with from the blog and different notes and things. Thank you all so much for today. It was really useful and really interesting. I think quite inspiring to hear kind of the buzz of the conversation. Don't forget your evaluation forms. And I think I'd like to invite you to all kind of give a round of applause for all our speakers, but all of you who contributed.